You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 1 a.m. in Beijing, 2000 in Kiev, 1800 here in London and 1300 in New York City. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. More Russian airstrikes on Ukraine, further Ukrainian gains in Russia. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Beijing. Is President Joe Biden legacy shopping in China? And how is one of Europe's most popular tourist destinations having one of its worst tourist seasons? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Zing Tsjeng and Terry Stiastny will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the returned foreign correspondent Michael Peel about his new book, looking at what his homeland doesn't know about itself. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Zing Tsjeng, former vice editor-in-chief. The emphases were all over the place there. Former editor-in-chief of Vice, now journalist and author, and Terry Stiastny, the author and political journalist. Hello to you both.
Hello. Hello.
Zing, first of all, welcome to the Daily for the very first time. As regular listeners will have guessed, we have dressed you up in the office owl suit by way of the customary hazing. But now that you've overcome that, basically introduce yourself. How did you get here?
Oh, well, I am actually significantly jet-lagged because I came here via Sri Lanka, where I was on holiday just a few days ago. But basically, I was the editor-in-chief of Vice and have been in that role since February. And then I'm now freelance, where I write for a variety of different publications, including The Guardian, The Times, British Vogue, and all of the other good places that we publish. Excellent.
Terry, of course, our listeners are by now abundantly familiar with you, but you have recently been to France generally, and I for one am sorry that our semi-resident weirdo museum's boffin Daniela is not here, because she would be delighted about what you saw.
Yes, so on the way we'll go down to the south of France pretty much every year and usually try and stop off somewhere different in France. And this year, every year, we pass a big sign on the French motorway which has got a massive image of the face of General de Gaulle, and it's his hometown of Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, and there's a big memorial there, and also a fantastic museum, which was a really surprisingly good museum, you know, when you don't expect necessarily very much. And it had just fantastic exhibits. You go into this beautiful building with an amazing view. On the ground floor, there is the car that de Gaulle was being driven in when they attempted to assassinate him. And the only trace of that is these little sort of white plaster stickers on the bullet holes where there were. There is the microphone that he used to give his wartime addresses on the BBC. And then actually a really good, really sort of interactive museum about his whole life, right from his origins right through to sort of 1968. And it was surprisingly entertaining.
That does sound genuinely very good. I am myself more of an aficionado of the completely terrible museum consecrated to a particular personality, and I feel bad saying this because they may have improved it in the 20 years or so since I was there, but the Ned Kelly Museum in Glenrowan in Victoria, I promise an absolute classic, though I can't guarantee that everybody else who goes there will be sworn at by a cockatoo, which is what happened to me. But we will pivot seamlessly from profane cockatoos to Ukraine, which has been on the receiving end of yet another significant wave of Russian drone and missile strikes. At least 4 people are known to have been killed as Russia again targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, causing outages of water and electricity in several cities. President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed a response but his forces are still on the march in Russia's Kursk Oblast. The Ukrainians now claim to hold nearly 1,300 square kilometres of Russian territory. That's about half of Luxembourg, including around 100 Russian settlements, and to have taken 600 Russian soldiers prisoner. Well, earlier I spoke to the Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik, leader of the opposition party, Holos.
I think we shouldn't be putting together the fact of the incursion and then the fact that Russia has been destroying our energy infrastructure for a while. They had those plans. We knew about those plans. We were asking our allies to arm us better so we can counteract toward those plans, but they did not change much. since the incursion. What happened after this special operation from our side was for the Western world to see that Russia is not invincible and can be defeated and can be fought back and should be fought back. And I think saying, oh, there will be a retaliation and this is a retaliation is a little bit unfair to Ukraine, because even at the time when we were not making the progress at the front line, the attacks on our cities continued every single night. And so what we need to do is to fight Russia back better, help our allies to understand what needs to be done so we will be armed better. And right now, the most important part is that we need to be able to use wide-range missiles onto Russian territory to be able to take down their planes and drones when they are just like starting their launch.
That was the Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik, leader of the Holos Party, speaking to me earlier today. Terry, first of all, the infrastructure raids appear to be, well, it's not necessarily Russia's new theme, but a renewed theme. Do we interpret these as a pre-winter warning? Winter comes early and hard in Ukraine.
Yes, I think it's partly that. I think it's partly some of the timing probably has to do with Ukraine celebrating its Independence Day and Russia trying to say, look, we can still attack you. We are not completely on the back foot. And I think, yeah, as we were just hearing, there is part of Russian strategy which, would try to think if you can destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure or damage it severely before winter, you're going to cause people probably quite a lot of hardship, and they'll be hoping that will damage morale within the country and perhaps damage Ukraine's willingness to keep fighting.
Zing, we heard from Kira Rudik, as we have heard once again today from President Volodymyr Zelensky, permission Ukraine wants to launch Western-supplied long-range weapons at Russia. Is there any reason at this point, given that we have, first of all, set so many red lines and then strolled blithely across them, why should anyone be squeamish about this at this point?
Well, I think actually the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said today that the British position on this hasn't changed. They still want Ukraine not to use these long-range weapons like the Storm Shadow missiles, which are made by the Anglo-French, and said that, we are still sticking firm to that particular red line. And what I think is really interesting is that I think Ukraine is starting to realize that, as you say, these red lines can just be breezed past. I think today Volodymyr Omelian, who is the former Ukrainian infrastructure minister, went onto radio and said that, the red line for Ukrainians to cross, the ultimate red line, is to capture Moscow, and that would not happen. But, that's quite an ambitious red line for them to set for themselves. But I do think that, there is the sense that, these red lines started happening and then slowly they were inched forward, then people inched past them. And definitely, the incursion into Kursk is definitely one of the biggest kind of incursions on a red line that has been happened since the war started.
I mean, it is a weird one, Terry, because if you can remember back, and I'm sure we all can, to 2.5 years ago when, Ukraine's allies, especially its European allies, were tying themselves in knots about whether we should let them have a couple of squadrons of mothballed Leopard tanks. And now we have 2.5 years later, Ukraine helping itself to chunks of Russian territory. But on that particular subject, do you get the impression that the Ukrainians might be a bit surprised by how long this incursion has lasted and how much of Kursk they've been able to take?
Well, yes, I think they probably are. And I think that's why the question exactly arises. I mean, this was supposed to be, they kept saying this is a sort of a diversionary tactic. We're doing this to help have the Russians have to move their forces away from where we're already fighting them to other places which are poorly defended. And I think they seem to be finding that they've, gone quite far into Russian territory without a huge amount of resistance, which is why this question of red lines comes up. How far do you keep going? And, it's a well-worn thing. You ask any, do you actually try to march on Moscow? Is that a very good idea? Generally in history, it's not, apart from the, where you're going to meet proper defences. But I think, I'm sure what the allies will be asking is, how far are you planning to go with this? How far is this just a sort of side move move, and how far are you continuing to fight on the main fronts, and where are you going to stop with this?
Well, by my reckoning, the Ukrainians are about 600 kilometres further from the gates of Moscow than Napoleon got, but they do have faster vehicles. It is hard to know, though, Zing, exactly what is going on, because Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Stiastny, he claims that the Kursk operation has diverted 30,000 Russian soldiers. We have, of course, no independent means of verifying that, but he also acknowledges that Russia is still proceeding towards Pokrovsk in Ukraine and other cities. It's almost like the two armies are marching past each other. Are they trying to see who's going to blink first here?
I do think that with the Kursk incursion, because it happened by surprise with, surprising Russia, surprising Ukraine's Western allies, I do think there's quite a lot of things happening behind the scenes that we may never know about, particularly when it comes to Ukraine strategizing about what the best kind of plan of action is. But you are right. I do think it sometimes feels as if this war is proceeding along parallel fronts. Ukraine kind of says this is a diversionary tactic, but from the way they're marching forward, it doesn't really seem that they just are happy to just hold the territory. They are moving forward. So I do think that if I was, one of Ukraine's Western allies, I would kind of be scratching my head and asking to be let into the thinking a little bit more, because it does seem like Ukraine is kind of taking matters into its own hands.
Just before we move off this, Terry, the other thing I keep thinking about is that we saw a little over a year ago during that bizarre insurrection by Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner Group, we saw Wagner stroll into a couple of fairly decent-sized Russian cities without any sign of the population being at all bothered that this was going on. Is there any possibility, and I guess there's two questions here, one that Ukraine might try their luck against either a city as big as Kursk or perhaps Belgorod, and if that does happen, does that become the point at which the Russian population start looking towards Moscow and thinking, who is this person we've placed our trust in?
Well, exactly. I was exactly remembering that, and exactly remembering quite how far the Wagner Group, got into Russia before, they were persuaded to to turn around and stop. And I think that must be, if you were a Russian, average Russian going about your business, it must, help you lose faith even probably a bit more in your government, particularly if you're being called on to go and, serve in the military, and you think, well, what are they doing right at the moment? But I do also wonder, what is Zelensky's thinking behind this? Is we'll take as much territory as we can in order that we can then offer nicely to give it up and then have something offered in return. So you say, well, of course you can have Kursk back, but we want the rest of, we want Crimea or whatever else it is that people are planning to discuss. So maybe that's the idea behind it, or maybe it's just they've got further than they expected to and didn't quite expect this to happen.
I think one of the more interesting things as a result of the Kursk incursion is that, apparently some of the captured soldiers have been verified to be conscripts, which is what Putin has said that he would never do. So he wouldn't send conscripts who are, men aged 18 to 30 serving mandatory military service. He wouldn't send them into combat. Legally speaking, he's allowed to do that, but he kind of, made a kind of pact with the Russian public to say, we won't send your boys off to frontline combat. So I think that is also a kind of significant issue for Putin when it comes to support for the war. Can you really trust whether or not Putin is doing what he says he will? Is he protecting the boys on the front? Or can you really trust that he's doing the things that he would say would defend Russia?
Well, we will turn now to the Middle East, and while most of the attention consumed by the region these last nearly 11 months has focused on Israel's assault on Gaza, there has been a smaller but related uptick of military action on the West Bank. Nearly 600 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes or ground operations on the West Bank since October 7th. Last night, at least 5 more were killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Nur Shams refugee camp near Tulkarm. There has also been an escalation in violence against Palestinians from West Bank settlers. Within the last day, 1 Palestinian has been shot dead and 3 others injured by settlers near Bethlehem. Zing, first of all, looking at the airstrike near Tulkarm, Palestinian sources, and granted these would be Fatah sources who would have little compunction about giving up a Hamas member, but they are acknowledging that at least one of the dead was a Hamas member. Does that possibly make this sound like it might have been a legitimate target?
Well, the IDF says that it was targeting what it called the command room of a terror cell. And I think what it's part of is an intensification of drone strikes on the occupied West Bank. So over the last 2 decades, aerial strikes and drone strikes have only really been deployed in that area a few times. But according to the UN, there's been about 50 in the occupied West Bank since October the 7th. So clearly Israel does think that there's something there to be done in the occupied West Bank. But I think this also comes against a backdrop, like you say, of increased settler violence. And that is also posing a question for the IDF and the Israeli authorities in the West Bank, because there are now more people coming out and saying that we need to take a stronger stance against this kind of extremist settler violence because we're in danger of losing grip on the region.
Yeah, I do want to come back to that because there are some extremely significant people within Israel's security establishment saying exactly that. But the West Bank itself, Terry, is that so far a dog that hasn't really barked, given that we have not seen a huge or large-scale uprising from West Bank Palestinians in support of their compatriots in Gaza?
Yes, and I think that is quite interesting that, people have sort of wondered whether that would happen. I think, the conditions in the West Bank have been so different from what we've seen in Gaza. And I think Israel, until now, and again, you say they are saying that this was a very specific targeted strike, and perhaps it's got more in common with the strikes that we've seen over the last few weeks against targets, Hamas-related people and Hezbollah elsewhere in the region. So it may be more part of that. But I think, the conditions in Gaza even before October the 7th were worse, I think, and people in the West Bank, I think, have possibly been reluctant to, to see the kind of things happening to them that has been happening to people in Gaza.
Because, Zing, one of the things that would appear to be part of the idea of a two-state solution that optimists are still clinging to would be that West Bank settlements would have to be stopped being built unless the Palestinian authorities were content for that to happen, or they would have to be removed. But is it now, if you look at this from the perspective not just of this Israeli government, but any Israeli government, that's now less likely because it does seem a fair enough statement of the obvious that had there still been Israeli settlements in Gaza and the accompanying Israeli military presence in Gaza, organising October 7th in the first place probably wouldn't have been possible.
It certainly would have been much more difficult. And I do think one of the problems of a two-state solution in which Israeli settlements are pulled from the occupied West Bank is that there's now a kind of very extreme, violent fringe of right-wing Israeli settlers who are already in the occupied West Bank. And, they're responsible for a lot of the violence that has been happening against Palestinians. So, for instance, there have been cars and homes set on fire, Molotov cocktails being thrown, stones being thrown, not just at Palestinians, but also at IDF and police forces that have come in to try and control these riots. So I think that any kind of two-state solution has to kind of take into account the fact that these kind of groups of kind of extremist settlers are probably going to want to hold their ground and that they will react very violently to anybody trying to pull them out of that territory.
One of the people who has been speaking up about this, to whom Zing was alluding, I'm sure, Terry, is Ronan Bar, who is head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service. He wrote to Benjamin Netanyahu this week saying a lot of things. I do recommend people look the letter up. But he also suggested in that West Bank settler violence a certain amount of complicity from Israeli police and indeed some members of the Knesset. Do we imagine, though, that any of that is actually news to Netanyahu?
No, I think, it's probably, I imagine, he would know about this. I mean, there's always, some of the settlers have often had a strange relationship with the state of Israel and with the government of Israel. And, although they have people who represent them, a lot of them don't necessarily agree with what the government is doing, and they just want to carry on, settling their own things in their own way. But I think it's just you just look at how many problems are facing the Israeli government on the domestic front as well. The unhappiness with people about the situation of the hostages, the problems on the border with Lebanon. You wonder for how long they can continue under so many different domestic and international pressures, particularly given, it's hard to believe it's almost going to be a year since October the 7th, and they're having to think, how do you mark this and when is the end in sight?
Because going back to this letter from Ronan Bar and going back to what Terry said there as well, Zing, I think at that moment of an IDF sentry I met in Hebron about 20 years ago who cheerfully defined his job to me as standing here risking my neck to protect fact, as he put it, a few dozen kooks who nobody likes and who shouldn't be here. He was, of course, referring to the West Bank settlers in Hebron. But I'm also thinking of an interview we did on the Foreign Desk with one of Ronan Bar's predecessors as the head of Shin Bet, which is Ami Ayalon, who took a very similar view that, well, as Ronan Bar puts it, he talks about the damage to the state of Israel, especially now and to the vast majority of the settlers, is indescribable. And he goes on to cite things like the delegitimization of the state of Israel, a cycle of war and a cycle of terror, and a slippery slope, as he puts it, to the feeling of a lack of governance. It always occurs to me that, I mean, you can see there the difference between the people who are thinking in terms of their nation's security, as Benjamin Netanyahu is supposed to do, and people who are thinking in terms of Benjamin Netanyahu's political survival, which is what he's actually doing.
Yes, and I think that's one of the really interesting things that is unfolding as a result of the upcoming commemoration of the October 7th event. So, a lot of kibbutzes and also hostage families have basically disavowed the official state commemoration of October 7th because they really object to the person who's been put in charge of it, who is a pro-Netanyahu minister named Miri Regev. Some of them are launching official boycotts. Some people are now saying that she should be removed completely. And I think it's kind of alluding to the fact that, in Israel, there's now incredibly a sense of growing discontent over the way that Netanyahu has handled this and how politicians are responding to not just only the commemoration of the attacks, but what will now happen with the hostages and the efforts to bring them back.
Well, we will now consider how US President Joe Biden might be prioritising his remaining 5 months in office. Having always fancied himself as a foreign policy eminence, the United States' relationship with China seems an obvious enough temptation. And today, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is in Beijing for the latest in a globe-spanning series of encounters with China's Secretary of State analog Wang Yi, officially burdened by the much less snappy title of Director of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee Foreign Affairs Commission. Zing, first of all, ahead of this particular meeting, China's foreign ministry has telegraphed that the US-China relationship is at a critical juncture, to which one could retort, isn't it always? But do they mean something in particular by that?
Well, I think the Biden administration has always taken a really tough stance on China. So, it's restricted Chinese access to American technology. It's tried its best to kind of balance, to try and ensure the balance of power in Taiwan and the South China Sea. But I think what is new is relations really deteriorating when, then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022. Mm-hmm. So that was considered a huge no-no. And then relations deteriorated even further the following year because, of course, we all remember the Chinese spy balloon that kind of drifted into American territory, which the US then shot down. So, things have been quite uniquely frosty for a while, I would say.
One thing, of course, which has changed in this dynamic, Terry, is that the United States until quite recently China would have been thinking until quite recently, well, how do we deal with a second term of Joe Biden? And they now know that that's not an option. But do you get the sense that they would prefer President Harris? At least they know what President Trump is and who he is and what he's like.
I don't really know which they would prefer. I mean, it's quite interesting that the Republicans seem to be picking up, particularly on Tim Walz's relationship with China, although he's been really critical. He had spent a lot of time there. He'd taught there. He'd gone back and forth and visiting. So, who would they rather have? I think, they will probably think of it in terms of state interests rather than individual interests. They, both of these are to a certain extent known quantities, and they seem to be making, some gradual steps. And it does seem that the Sullivan relationship has become quite promising. Although it's the first trip since 2016 from a security advisor. He'd met his counterpart in Bangkok in January, and they kind of gradually ratcheting things up in terms of the contact. So it sounds like that's a reasonably promising relationship. So maybe they think, well, these are people we're getting the measure of now, so maybe it's better to have somebody predictable rather than someone less predictable in the form of Trump.
But Zing, to follow that up, do you think China would see Trump as less predictable? On the one hand, they understand that he thinks there's political mileage in beating up on China, and there probably is when you're running for office in the United States, but they had 4 years of him. Don't they have the cheat codes by now?
Ooh, it's an interesting one. I mean, I would say that Trump is a kind of known unknown quantity in that, in the years that he was out of office, people basically wrote him off. And then he has since come back, stronger in the sense that nobody really predicted that he could take over the Republican Party and remold it in his image quite so effectively. So I think, in terms of whether or not China would prefer Kamala Harris or Trump, I think they would probably go for the one who seems like the more stable, knowable quantity. Kamala Harris has done multiple trips abroad as a representative, as the vice president. So I think if I was in the Chinese Communist Party, I'd be plumping for Kamala.
Just finally on that, Zing, there is some suggestion that what Sullivan is hoping to conjure into being is another summit between Xi Jinping and President Biden. Do you imagine Xi would actually turn up for that, or might he be thinking, well, what's the point?
I think it honestly depends on who's going to end up in the White House. Will there be political hay to be made out of a photo opportunity with the next president of the United States, depending on who that might be? Will an image of Xi Jinping shaking hands with Donald Trump travel further and be more impressive than him shaking hands with Kamala Harris? So I think really it kind of depends on whatever happens in November in the United States.
Well, it has become a common refrain of a European summer, the complaint that a small number of destinations are absolutely swamped with tourists to a degree that vexes both the locals and the tourists, who are united in being annoyed by tourists. The proverbially picturesque Greek island of Santorini has a variation of this problem. It is absolutely crammed to the gunwales by day as cruise ships disgorge thousands of people seeking to fill their Instagrams with pictures absolutely nobody is really interested in, but is deserted by night as the hordes return to their cabins. Santorini's hotels and restaurants are having one of their lowest high seasons ever. Terry, we appear to have reached a sort of event horizon of modern tourism here. People are put off going to an island which is apparently actually undercrowded because of a perception that it's overcrowded.
Yeah, but I think this problem here is cruise ships. I mean, if you go to anywhere, I was in Taormina, it was a couple of years ago in Sicily, beautiful place, lovely scenery, and relatively quiet. Then suddenly a cruise ship docks and it is full of people all following around with little tour guides with umbrellas, and you can't move. And so the thing from a tourist destination point of view is these people are there for a day or a few hours. They're not spending any money. They might buy an ice cream and a couple of souvenirs, but mostly they're being ushered on by their tour guides going, don't stop, keep walking. And, you get overrun with that. So, if that is happening constantly in places like Venice and stuff, and the scale of some of these ships, they are so disproportionate to the places where they stop and visit. It's not surprising that the local people and other tourists get annoyed about it.
At which I put to you, Zing, the question on where are we then on imposing some limits or charging admission fees, as Venice has tentatively started to for one.
Well, I actually feel like I'm the angel of death for overtourism, because I visited Venice, and then shortly afterwards they imposed the fee. And I also visited Santorini, and now I hear that the mayor is also proposing a kind of similar
What kind of trouble have you been causing in these places?
I know. I mean, what can I say? My entire family fits onto a cruise ship. So. But I mean, it's an interesting idea, because when I was in Venice and Santorini, I saw exactly what, people are now describing as happening in Santorini. You would get these moments where you would be so rammed in, you could barely move in certain parts of the city or town. And then you would just walk maybe 20, 25 minutes to somewhere else and it'd be completely empty. So I'd be staying in hotels and guest houses that did feel like they were under capacity. When you went out for dinner, you did feel like you had loads of space. So it was great for me, but presumably for the restaurateurs, for the people running hotels, this is really not how you create a sustainable tourism industry.
I mean, there has been a lot of chat about this kind of stuff this summer in particular, it feels like, Terry. There's even been protests against tourists. There's been tourists in some places being pelted with water bombs by, frankly, ungrateful locals. Is there also an amount of, how to put it, massive unreconstructed snobbery in play here? I commend listeners to an editorial by our editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, in this morning's Monocle Minute, where he does urge that everybody stop looking down on those who go to the places that everybody else is going to.
Yes, I think it could be spread around more. And I think as you see this on a sort of micro scale, I was also in the Cotswolds recently, and it's a very beautiful village, and I've got family there, and people apparently in the village, some of them were organising a demonstration. I don't know if it ever happened because it was raining that day. I'm not sure if it did. Against all the coaches that turn up and come and take. And it is, okay, it is quite annoying when you get people doing their Instagram photos in front of the picturesque house. And I saw someone there the other day leaning over into someone's garden, taking pictures of their laundry and of their chickens. I'm not sure where that was going to go, why they wanted pictures of these people's laundry. So it is kind of annoying, but it also does help keep your village thriving, and it helps the restaurant survive, and it helps the pub survive, and it does provide jobs for some people. So, and yes, people, if you haven't got much time to see the whole country, you're going to go and visit a few sites. So yes, the sympathy is not necessarily these people's fault, but maybe it's the tour organisers, the cruise ship organisers that need to think a bit and diversify a bit.
And Zing, and just finally on this, is this yet another thing for which we can blame social media? Because it is my own contention that in the entire history of human endeavour, nobody has ever actually been interested in looking at anybody else's holiday snaps. Even in the pre-digital cameras age, if somebody whipped out their pictures that they took while backpacking, you never heard your internal monologue going, oh, great. But Instagram and other platforms does encourage us to believe that everybody is riveted by this.
Yes, I actually think Instagram has to do with quite a lot of what is afflicting places like Santorini and Venice. Because on Instagram and other social media platforms, obviously, you get the kind of sense that there's a hit list of places that you have to photograph, you have to take pictures in, you have to take a video of yourself in at the expense of other places that could do with a little bit more love and a little bit more attention, places with equally good restaurants and beauty spots that just don't simply get the same attention. So, for instance, I came back recently from a holiday in Sri Lanka. One of the biggest attractions is a mountain town called Ella, which is right next to some tea plantations. It's lovely, but there are also equally other lovely mountain towns with the exact same access, with the exact same viewpoints and the same lovely food. So, it really is about, I think, how social media has completely kind of diverted attention from a more sustainable, spread out form of tourism and just completely concentrated into some hotspots. And the locals are understandably quite fed up with it.
Zing Tsjeng and Terry Stiastny, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is one of the better questions posed by Rudyard Kipling in his poem The English Flag. What should they know of England who only England know? However, a new book by our next guest wonders if they know even that much. What Everyone Knows About Britain Except the British by Michael Peel is a view of Britain by a Breton who has spent many years abroad and who takes a long, hard look at his homeland from a distance. I spoke to Michael at Midori House earlier. I began by asking him about the premise of his book and whether or not the UK really does kid itself any more than other countries.
There are two levels of answer to that. I think the first level is that, all countries are parochial to some extent, all have their national myths of varying types, but obviously with many common themes, and it's become a truism that, everyone thinks that they're exceptional in the same way, and there is an element of truth to that. But what you have in Britain, which one of the interviewees in the book points out, a German-born naturalised Brit, is that you've got this deep bedrock of written history and myth being built upon myth. And so, you go back to modern myths, wartime myths, and then there's a layer of Victorian myth, and then there's sort of Tudor myths, and then you can keep on sort of going down the geological strata. And I think that that's what makes it particularly resilient and particularly deep in the country, that this sense of some slightly sort of odd perspectives on some things.
It always strikes me, for all that I have lived here a long time, I am a foreigner here myself, that the two big things that loom at the heart of all British delusions are the empire, obviously, and then the event which hastened the empire to a close, i.e. World War II. And the latter one in particular, do you subscribe to the view that the United Kingdom has never really grown out of that at some level it still thinks it's fighting them on the beaches?
I think there is a sense of that, and again, I would look at that in two ways. The obvious one is in the sort of jingoistic strain in our politics, exemplified by Nigel Farage's parties, but not limited to that, and actually to some extent cutting across the political spectrum and that exceptionalist streak. But the other sort of interesting element about it is I think it caused particular damage because it led to a complacency and perhaps an underestimation of our own vulnerability in this country, that, having avoided invasion, no small part through being an island, we in Britain maybe subconsciously took the wrong lesson for that and assumed that, everything's will be okay, and that because it's Britain, and that manifests itself in practical terms, as I go into in one chapter, in a lack of preparedness about some rather important things. And I sort of look at this idea of, has Britain's sort of traditional sort of advantage, i.e. being an island and avoiding invasion for a very long time, actually turned into a disadvantage in some ways in a world of political tensions, supply chain wars and so on. Britain is short of rather key resources, from critical minerals to certain foodstuffs, and has just burned some bridges with its near neighbours, and so finds itself in this position where it really needs to step back and look in a less complacent way about, well, how can we improve our resilience?
Because there is a thought in there which the book addresses a few times, this general mentality of it'll all be fine, we'll muddle through, because by and large in Britain's history it has all been fine. Britain has muddled through, but as you point out, and as you have noticed from working abroad, when things unravel, they can unravel really, really fast. Do you think that actually is a danger in the UK, or do you buy even slightly into that idea that the UK, if not perhaps uniquely, then is certainly unusually impervious to upheaval of that sort?
I think it's a mistake to assume that anywhere is immune to upheaval, and I think the UK is no exception to that. And I think the dark side of what is often proclaimed as a great advantage of Britain, its lack of a written constitution, is that it's a situation where everything works fine until one day it doesn't, because there's some pressure on the system which causes it to buckle and break in some way, when suddenly, customs that have been observed for a long time no longer are. And I think the other thing is that we need to step out of ourselves a bit. And, when we look at countries where, politics seems to be going a little bit crazy, the United States, for example, to then sort of reflect that back on ourselves and say, well, actually, we may have slightly different sort of symptoms here, but there are some really deep sort of structural problems with the way our system works here, which we see manifested perhaps in the sort of exotic choices of leaders in recent years. But also, if you look at something like the House of Lords, again, it's not a new observation, but just how remarkable is it that in, this place that is supposedly, home to the mother of parliaments, there are still people who are in that parliament through birthright. It's crazy. There are still clerics in that parliament. And, I quote the unflattering observation that people have made that, if you're looking at where clerics have political power, well, there's Iran and there's Britain spring to mind.
I mean, this is one of many eccentricities, to put it charitably, about this country that does rather fly under the general radar. And your introduction in particular cites chapter and verse of common assumptions that modern British people make about their country, and how those are not just wrong, but to borrow the famous quote by, I think, Richard Feynman, they're not even wrong. They're just so completely at odds with reality. And obviously that does not promote informed decision-making by the public. Did you come down anywhere on thinking what is responsible for that and what might be done about it? Is it that people are poorly educated? Is it that the media does a lousy job of actually explaining things? Or is it that thing which I guess goes to the heart of your book, that people believe what they want to be true?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question, and I think that there are definitely elements of truth in a lot of what you said. I mean, I just wanted to pause for a moment and just look at the idea of education, which is something I'm very interested in, that there's this assumption, I regret to say, among some people on the left and the anti-Brexit side, that, people who oppose their point of view are stupid. They disdain them, they look down on them, which is not only morally wrong in my view, but it's also a mistake, because people with high degrees of formal education make a lot of crazy decisions themselves.
Frequently.
So I'm not sure it's education so much as a general environment in which we all live, where polling suggests, as you say, that there are sort of certain things to do with, for example, the makeup of religions in this country, where people were born, what government spends its money on, where people are not just wrong, but sometimes wildly wrong, and that often these do sort of skew in the direction of scare stories that appear particularly in conservative media on immigration and people supposedly defrauding the benefit system and so on. So I think that definitely plays its part. And I think there's also a very interesting point which is brought out by the polling. And by the way, Britain is not the only country that has misconceptions about itself, but there are some sort of interesting ones here that it's particularly acute, this idea that there are people that are defrauding the system. That's very kind of deeply ingrained, I think, for sort of political reasons and to do with the media environment. But the other point that I think comes out in that chapter through the data and through the conversations I have in it is that it has something to do with age and threat perception, that as people get older, they tend to feel threats more acutely, whether these are real threats or perceived threats, for understandable reasons. There's a vulnerability there. And I think, as the population of the country ages, I think that also feeds into that as well.
That was Michael Peel speaking to me earlier. His book, What Everyone Knows About Britain Except the British, Home Truths from a Foreign Correspondent, is available now and very much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Zing Tsjeng and Terry Stiastny. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Sana Jamani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.